Okay, we pick up this time where we left off before with the surprising triumph of King Hezekiah, who leads the city of Jerusalem in its great standoff with the Assyrian army, the mighty Assyrian army under the leadership of Sennacherib. Sennacherib besieges the city, and for reasons that are not entirely clear, apparently there was some sort of a plague, perhaps, or what Herodotus describes as some kind of a disease involving mice, something along those lines. The Assyrian army departs, and is called back home. Now, obviously, as we'll get into the study of this more closely, it's more complicated than even this, but something happens that causes the siege to break, and Hezekiah emerges triumphant. And remember, of course, Hezekiah himself is very much the child of promise, at least as we will be mostly interpreting the book of Isaiah, particularly the promise of the new child in Isaiah 7, 9, and the great Davidic king in Isaiah 11. That whole sort of messianic complex of ideas seems to be at least provisionally fulfilled in the great figure of Hezekiah. Okay, so Hezekiah is the one king who very much exemplifies the success of Isaianic theology, if you will. Well, of course, the success does not last forever, but it does have ripple effects that last for generations. Hezekiah was not only a great king in terms of his political and military leadership, in effect staving off the false propaganda of the Assyrian army at the wall of Jerusalem, but also in being a great religious reformer. Okay, he was an aggressive purger of idols, and an aggressive closer of holy places, an aggressive persecutor of those who pursued other religions other than strict Yahwism. Josiah, his great-grandson, very much followed along those lines. Okay, Josiah emerged despite the rather ineptitude and corruption of his father Manasseh, great-grandfather Manasseh rather, and his father Ammon. Nonetheless, Josiah really embarks on an even much more aggressive program of reform, and you see here, this is the biblical account, picture, if you will, that dramatizes the account in 2 Kings 22, where the scribes find the old book of the law in the temple. Okay, and they present it, as the story goes, to Josiah, the king, who is greatly dismayed that the people have not been following the law. It's basically been stuffed away in the temple and become a great artifact, collecting dust, but in no way illuminating the lives of Judah. And consequently, he rends his robe out of frustration and great remorse and mourning, and ultimately enjoins the law once again upon all of Judah. He has a great Passover feast, at which he even tries to reunite the old, what's left of them, the 10 tribes of Israel, which is only moderately successful. But anyway, Josiah is known as being a great religious reformer, as was his great-grandfather Hezekiah. Okay, he, of course, did what he did under the leadership, or under the advice, if you will, of the prophet Jeremiah. Okay, so we're talking now in terms of the late 7th century, right around 620, 615 or so BC. So we're talking now close to, the better part of a century after the death of Isaiah. Okay, Isaiah, we don't know exactly when he goes, but he probably leaves, dies around 690 or so, 695, or perhaps even shortly after the siege of Israel in 701, or of Judah in 701. But much like he had advised Hezekiah, his prophetic predecessor, Jeremiah, really takes on the role of being the great advisor, the great spiritual advisor of Josiah. Okay, so in other words, what he is to Hezekiah, Jeremiah is to Josiah. Okay, well, unfortunately, it doesn't work out quite as well for Jeremiah as it did for Isaiah. And indeed, the book of Isaiah, the first part of the book of Isaiah, ends on a very ominous prediction that eventually the kingdom will fall to Babylon. Okay, and Isaiah seems to know this because of his king Hezekiah's foolish solicitude toward the Babylonians and allowing them into the treasury to see the various things that the wealth of the temple had. Okay, that sooner or later all these things, along with the temple itself, will be carted off to Babylon, and the Davidic kingdom will be destroyed. But nonetheless, Josiah is something of a spiritual high mark, if you will, for a short time under the advice of Jeremiah. Josiah embarks, as we said, upon an aggressive series of reforms designed to really revive the law and to make rigorous the keeping of the law within Israel. But unfortunately, things get rather complicated. There's something of a power vacuum because at this period of time, the old Assyrian Empire, and we can see it here at its maximum extent, begins a slow process of crumbling. Okay, it begins to crumble really around 671 or so when it reaches its maximum extent and begins to be too beset by internal difficulties to continue to exert too much pressure upon the various vassal states like Egypt and like Judah, who begin to, in this period of time, break free. Well, a power vacuum ensues, and of course you always know what happens with power vacuums. There's usually a struggle between the new powers, the new kids in the block, to be able to take over, okay, and assert themselves. And so ultimately there's sort of a test of who's going to be the rightful heir apparent to the Assyrian Empire. You basically have two contenders. The first contender is Egypt to the south. Okay, Egypt has always been a great empire, and indeed under the leadership of Pharaoh Necho, pictured here, actually not pictured, but a statue of him here, Egypt is very much interested in asserting its domination over Canaan as it had century or millennia before. Okay, but of course the other great rival is Babylon. And I think we probably know how this is going to turn out. But unfortunately, in the meantime, in the process of rushing into this area to shore up the Babylonian, to shore up the what's left of the Assyrian Empire, Pharaoh Necho crosses through Israel and Judah and meets King Josiah on the plains of Megiddo and kills him, okay, according to 2 Kings 23. And this is how the plains of Megiddo become so famous. The word Armageddon comes from the word Megiddo. Megiddo is the plains, the great battlefield in which Josiah, the king, died at the hands of Pharaoh Necho. And of course, the great prototype here is, of course, the wonderful king who's cut down in his prime before his reforms have a chance to take effect. But the defeat is devastating, and this happens in 609. That Josiah is put to death by Pharaoh Necho, and this leads, of course, to the Battle of Carchemish in 3 or 4 years later, in which Egypt is basically driven out by Babylon. Okay, and this marks the complete and final coup de grace for what's left of the Assyrian Empire. And with this, you see the great emergence of Babylon, the great unparalleled and almost unrivaled emergence of Babylon. Judah, you can see here, is in big trouble. And this time, as we know or should know, Judah is not going to be able to survive. Okay, whatever fidelity God had to the Davidic throne in 701 BC, when through the intercession and intervention of Isaiah and Hezekiah, the empire was able to survive. This will not be the case now, this time. Okay, so what we're going to see here is that the Davidic kingdom is finally destroyed, and this is a Baroque depiction of this. You see on the right here is the last king of Judah, that is Zedekiah, who is finally slain by King Nebuchadnezzar, okay, as he's holding the plans for Jerusalem. The defeat was total. Not only was the kingdom destroyed, but the temple had been completely ransacked, destroyed, burned on the inside, rendered unfit for worship, and all of its goods had been, his vessels, sacred vessels, had been carted off to Babylon. This was something which, of course, was a profound theological emergency for a variety of reasons, but first and foremost, because of God's supposed, I might say, fidelity to the Davidic throne. How could this be? If God had promised that an heir to David would always sit upon the Davidic throne, as he clearly does in 2 Samuel and many other places, how does God's fidelity manifest itself now after this horrific event is allowed to take place? It's not at all clear what God is going to be able to do to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And this is, of course, the great challenge. The great challenge that the prophets rush to the scene to be able to offer a solution to. Well, naturally, the first and probably certainly the most archetypical, prototypical prophet of the exile is Jeremiah. You see him here in his famous portrait, lamenting over the fall of Jerusalem, the fall which he tried so hard to stave off. In fact, the great rebellion of Zedekiah, which was horribly ill-advised, which he strongly counseled against, nonetheless fell on deaf ears. In other words, that he had in effect lost the ear of the monarch. Had the monarchs continued to listen to him, it's entirely possible that the nation might have been saved, but it wasn't. And so he very much leads the effort to help prophetically piece things together again. In the book of Maccabees, he's attributed with being the person who, at the very eve of the exile, takes the Ark of the Covenant away from the temple and takes it off into the mountains east of Israel, in Mount Nebo, where Moses himself had died. And he is also known for being the person who launched the great Jeremiah, the great, horrible, loud, obnoxious, sometimes prophecies that never get heard. Okay, the great archetype prophet who's unlistened to and unheard is very much the archetype of Jeremiah. He spends most of the exile in Egypt, in fact, living his days out, attempting to help Israel make sense of what's happened. And indeed, he comes up with many, many things of which we will go over later in the course, which will help us to make sense of this. And we see again, the other great prophet of the exile we should remark on is Ezekiel. And he's seen here. This is the one at the top of the Sistine Chapel, the depiction of him. He's, of course, a very different man than Jeremiah. He was not a royal advisor like Jeremiah was. In fact, he was probably a priest in the temple who, along with most of the temple establishment, was driven away into Babylon, probably in the first wave of deportation. And he writes his prophecies as part of a vision of how God is ultimately going to restore Israel and restore the great temple, a great eschatological temple, which will be the means by which God will put together the pieces of the broken Israel. And of course, this is all very much leading up to the most luscious poetry at all, which is in the second half of the book of Isaiah, written, we think, by an anonymous poet, probably one who considered himself to be a disciple of the great Isaiah. and in some connection to him. In other words, someone seeing himself in succession to him and, in effect, bringing his prophecies forward, his original words forward to a new time. In other words, updating the idea of God's covenant fidelity, making clear that God had, in fact, never forgotten his promises of old, all appearances to the contrary. Making clear that God, in fact, would be true, and that although Isaiah's original charge had been to preach and cause rejection among the people, that eventually, after the great judgment had fallen, this would give way to a time when the people would be able to hear again the word of the Lord. And of course, this restored community is going to be centered, as we will see, around a remnant community, possibly centered around a prophet who defines his prophetic ministry through great suffering. And we see this in Isaiah 50, and especially in Isaiah 52 and 53, in the great, justly famous suffering servant poetry, which will be, in many ways, the centerpiece of how God will, in effect, restore old Israel. He will breathe the Holy Spirit. He will justify. He will save. He will regather the exiles who've been scattered to Babylon. But in doing so, this will involve many things. It will involve the Holy Spirit. It will involve the Spirit being given. It will involve a form of restoration, but it will also involve great suffering. But in doing so, that paradoxically, God will not have his plans set back, but in fact will show that far from having his plans thwarted by this horrific event of the rise of Babylon, that in fact, in the deepest irony of all, that the great exile that ensues when Judah is destroyed and all the people are scattered, once again the temple is destroyed, that actually this will be the very means by which God's great glory will be shown for all the people of the world to be able to see. Now, all of this comes to us courtesy of the second half of the book of Isaiah. Well, how this comes to pass, we will talk about next week. Not next week, but next time. It will involve here again, God once again acting in history through the people of Persia.